Republican instead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey, folks, and welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. I am your host, Rick Wilson, as always, and I'm delighted to be joined today by my friend Brad Meltzer. Brad is a renowned writer and novelist who has covered every possible base you can imagine in things he's written about, from heroes to villains and everything in between, from thrillers to kids' books and everything in between. He has a new book coming out in just a few days called The JFK Conspiracy, The Secret Plot to Kill Kennedy and Why It Failed. So, Brad, we famously know of a plot to kill Kennedy that succeeded. Talk to us about this book. Tell me a little bit about its origin story, how you came across this, and why it's relevant in the whole Kennedy narrative and story.
Yeah, and listen, you know me long enough to know I just love a good story. And we all know the story of JFK, of course, famously getting killed in Dallas, but there was actually a plot before that. This is in 1960, the beginning of his presidency. He's just been elected, and he's basically an assassin has parked his car with 7 sticks of dynamite outside of JFK's place in Palm Beach, Florida. In fact, he's picked Palm Beach, Florida, because he thinks Kennedy's security is weakest there, and he's right about that. And he also knows that every Sunday, Kennedy always leaves his house right before his 10 a.m. church service. So at 9:50, the killer's waiting outside. Sure enough, JFK is right on time. All the assassin has to do is hit the gas, push the button on the trigger device he's built, and boom, truly will go the dynamite. And I just ruined chapter 1 of the JFK conspiracy, I think. But what saves his life, I won't ruin this part, what saves his life in that moment, and the reason he doesn't die, is one of the craziest JFK stories you've never heard in your life. And I know it's titillating for me to say, hey, listen, we found this cool JFK story that you don't know about to kill him. But what makes it interesting is what it tells us about today. Because the 1960 election where Kennedy is elected is a moment where it's the most closely divided election in modern time. It's a moment where whatever side you're on, Nixon or Kennedy, you think the other side are horrible, awful people. Does that sound familiar to you?
Oh, rather.
I know, right? It sounds a little too close. But, you know, he's a guy who, because he's Catholic, because they treat him like an immigrant, they consider him an Irish Catholic immigrant, he's vilified. And when you drudge up that much hatred, you can't be surprised when you activate some lunatic out there.
So this guy who is lost to most history, how was he discovered? What happened that day? How did this story get into the record? How did this story become part of the narrative?
Yeah, and let's talk about that. So Richard Pavlik is the name of this disgruntled postal worker, former postal worker, who's truly putting the postal in postal worker, right? And, you know, he's a guy who, because you got to ask the question, right? Why do I not know this story? The story, when it happens, is the biggest story in the country. It's going to run everywhere. They capture the guy eventually. You know, when you see how it's amazing. But at the same time, as it's about to hit the front page of every paper, there's 2 airliners crash above New York City, and everyone on board dies. Pieces of it fall in Brooklyn and fall in Staten Island. Everyone's dead except for one kid, one sole survivor, and America becomes obsessed with this kid. And as a result, this JFK story about Richard Pavlik goes into the footnotes of history until I find it. And Josh and I find it, and we're like, this is the craziest story. We got to tell this story because you got to talk about what's happening in the context of what they're doing to Kennedy. And most important to Jackie, we should talk about as this is happening.
So Kennedy was a guy who had been through some traumas in his life. He wasn't afraid of danger. So he was a little dismissive of this, right?
Yeah, not only that, he's like, World War II tried to kill me. The Japanese tried to kill me. They didn't do it. Why should I be scared of this guy from Florida? He's,
Right.
he's dismissive of it. And the head of the Secret Service at the time says, this is the closest call of a modern US president to ever happen. They're terrified. So they know they have to make changes. Of course, those changes don't work. But I think what's interesting is the security part is fascinating. But, especially from where you come from in this wonderful world you work in, Rick, is who's attacking Kennedy also at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And you have this conservative religious right that's, Reverend Norman Vincent Peale at the time is one of the most prominent Christian ministers in the country. He writes the famous book, The Power of Positive Thinking. But the only thing he's positive about is he wants to make sure Kennedy's not elected. And he's working secretly, well, no one knows, I didn't know this story. He's working secretly with Reverend Billy Graham, who's a beloved guy through history. But basically, now we may think it's kind of almost, we don't think of Protestants and Catholics hating each other like that. But back in the day, in 1960, they're like, listen, man, this guy's a Catholic. He's not going to be loyal to the United States. He's not going to be loyal to anything but his own pope. We got to make sure he never reaches the White House. And at the same time that's happening, there's a resurgence of the KKK. And of course, we all know the KKK from the Civil War and, murdering black people and targeting the black community. But in the 1920s, they realized they can increase their dues by increasing the hatred. And they start hating brand new groups like the Jews and immigrants. Boy, that brings in the money. And so you have this moment, and again, it's just racism, right? But it's exactly kind of where we come again when you look at where we are now as a culture. When you have a side that just wants to vilify the other side, that just wants to say, those people are different from us and we got to get them. Don't be surprised when you activate some lunatic out there. And that's what the Secret Service, when I talked to them about today, that's what they warned me about today. There's a reason we saw that happen with that car exploding out of the Trump Hotel. There's a reason we saw what happened in New Orleans. There's so much venom that's been unleashed. And, I sadly think it's going to keep happening.
So the parallels of that moment, anti-Catholic, and yes, you're right, Norman Vincent Peale and others in that nascent evangelical movement were very much of a mindset that Kennedy was not a loyal American and could not definitionally be a loyal American because he was Catholic.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is, and again, the Catholic part we can change, but what they see is that same thing we see today is like those people, right? That's what we are. That is used. It is a part of the recipe of authoritarianism is to figure out a group of people you can blame problems on, and those people in World War II is the Jewish people. It could be the black community, it could be the gay community. It could be, of course, the immigrant community right now. But you see those words and it activates people. And this guy who does this, Richard Pavlik, he's listening to that. He's a Nixon Republican. He's a guy who doesn't like Catholics long before what Norman Vincent Peale says. He wants to make sure that only people like him are in the military as a group of, doing just that. But when I spoke to the Secret Service, we're writing this book. I spoke to the Secret Service years ago and I said, tell me about the people who killed the president. And they study them. They obviously look at them and say, well, what can we make of them?
Yeah,
And they split into two groups. There's hunters and there's howlers. And a howler is someone who's like very, very verbal. I'm going to kill him. I hate that president. I hate that guy. I want him dead. And those guys talk a big game, but they rarely do anything. But the hunters are very different. The hunters rarely say a word. They don't tell you they're coming. And those are the guys who pull the trigger. And if you look, the Secret Service told me, if you look at the 4 people who've successfully killed presidents, from Abraham Lincoln to JFK, every single one of them is a hunter. And Richard Pavlik, who tries to kill JFK in the JFK Conspiracy, this guy, he starts as a hunter, but he can't help it. He's a howler, opens his mouth, and he can't keep his mouth shut. And one of the people that he's watching the whole time, we should talk about it, is Jackie Kennedy. And she's the one who, to me, really pulls the story to life. She's amazing.
So how did Jackie Kennedy, what was her take on this, her role in this? How did it affect her? And I guess now that knowing about this, did she draw a through line in her mind on November 22nd, 1963 to this moment?
Yeah, the interesting part is she actually, no one to this day knows if what she thought about it. She didn't write about it to anyone. They don't even know if Kennedy told her. He didn't tell her. The question is, did she learn about it through the papers? Odds are she probably learned about it. Obviously not thrilled about it. She was dealing with, hating the fact the Secret Service were following her around. When we were working on the book, the great Clint Hill, who was her Secret Service, her assigned directly to her, it just gave us, amazing firsthand view. And if you love Jackie, you're fascinated by her. I mean, my wife was reading this book and she's like, Jackie steals the show. And the reason she steals the show is, Rick, we've reduced Kennedy to like this, he's the handsome guy who had his head blown off in Dallas. Or he's the handsome guy who has the perfect wife and the perfect life and the perfect teeth and the perfect hair. And that's a cliche. That's not a human being. And so, what I love about when we got into Jackie is when she gets engaged to JFK, one of JFK's friends comes right to her face and says, Jack likes women. Basically says to her face, he's going to sleep around on you. And she's like, you know what? Not on me. I'm going to figure it out, a way out of it. And I kept, as I'm reading this, I kept going like, where is Camelot? Like, when's Camelot come in? And as I'm researching the book, I finally figured out is we all associate Camelot with the JFK administration, but Camelot doesn't enter the lexicon until after he dies. JFK's brains go spattering across her beautiful pink suit. And America wants to hear from Jackie. She's granting no interviews at all. And finally, she says, Life magazine's doing a special magazine on the JFK true assassination. We need to hear from Jackie. Jackie says, I'm granting one interview. She has this reporter come down to her where she lives, and he sits with her for a couple hours at past midnight, and she tells the story, the exclusive story, that when JFK's back was hurting, when he was really suffering in the White House, she used to put on this record for him about this place called Camelot. And Jackie Kennedy, as you know, was a member of the press when she was young. She used to be a cub reporter.
Yes.
And she's also hounded by the press. She's tortured by the press. She's vilified by the press. She's held up by the press. But make no mistake, Rick, she is a master of the press.
Oh, yes.
She is the one who inserts that word, Camelot, into the lexicon. And that's why we think it's Camelot, not because JFK is so great, but because she intentionally puts it there. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, when you tell the story of this plot to kill JFK, again, it's titillating to say we found this cool plot. But boy, it's America. Is JFK this amazing World War II hero who saves the day and risks his life and takes us to the moon and gives us idealism? Or is he a reckless husband who abandons his wife? You'll see in the book, right as she's giving birth. I mean, when you see the affairs we show in the book, is he good? Is he bad? Or is he like all of us, a little bit of both? And it winds up becoming this amazing story of America itself.
It is underestimated how much of a player she was in an understood image and understood the style and understood the ability to craft those pictures in that nascent early TV era, especially.
That's exactly right. I mean, the story we've told and the groupthink story we tell now is JFK is more handsome than Nixon. He wasn't sweating. That's why he won. And that does a huge disservice to what Jack and Jackie know better than anyone, which is it's not just that they look good on TV. They know how to use TV. They're the first TV, like, Eisenhower's there and TV's running, but JFK and Jackie are the ones who are like, wait a minute, this is a delivery device. And I'll say it. I mean, that if JFK was the first TV president who knew how to use it, that's what Donald Trump is, right? He's just the guy who knows how to use that tech. Whatever you think about him, right? The guy knows how to use it. And what's fascinating is Jackie is like, they put her out. She speaks Spanish. They're like, wait, she speaks Spanish? We can put her on TV and have her talk to the Hispanic community. And we can get this whole new demographic that no one was catering to before. And we can dub her voice with her sister's voice and put her in another language because her sister speaks another language. And they are using this. They are not stupid at all. And the more Jackie doesn't want to be on TV, more fascinating she becomes. In fact, JFK goes abroad and he introduces himself and says, hi, you might know me. I'm Jackie's husband. Because at that point, she's arguably as famous as he is.
So this idea that Kennedy is, and he was a handsome, poised, he looked young and energetic and youthful. Do you think in your reporting and writing this that he was too cocky about the risks around him? That having been tested by war, his attitude was essentially, it's not, they're not going to get me, and I'm not going to worry about it. I mean, because I've read so many books about the assassination. If you're a president in an open car, there are historical, way back to the Archduke Ferdinand, that this could not necessarily a good thing to do. I always like to look at the counterfactuals of that day. What if it had been bad weather? What if it had been a different, what if somebody convinced him not to take the open car? Was his thinking at all affected by this event?
Yeah, listen, obviously you can never get into his brain. We end the book, when we did the Nazi conspiracy, you ended with us beating the Nazis, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we end the Lincoln one, we go with the end of the Civil War, but you can't talk about JFK's life and not go to the end. We end the book by showing you the firsthand account of Jackie Kennedy when her husband died. We go to from the assassination that almost happens. We end by examining and diving into it. I mean, I was obsessed with the story. And the thing that's fascinating, I don't know to this moment, no one knows whether JFK is cocky because he survived World War II and so many death-defying moments, and that's why he's cocky, that nothing can hurt him, or just because he's JFK and he just thinks, he's still the rich guy who can't be touched. I mean, he's cocky with not just his life, but with his marriage. He is so reckless with that marriage. And, there's a point in time where they're paying people off. Everyone in Washington knows the story of what he's doing sleeping around. And if you go and report that story to the papers, they're going to your house and knocking on your door and saying, we are going to finish you if you tell that story again. And there's no Twitter. There's no nothing, there's no X to put, threads to put it out on. There's just tough. And so JFK has no, if I were him, why should he be worried? And yes, it's this shot that Oswald takes, as you said, everything goes perfectly the wrong way that day. The weather, if it rains, then they put the bubble on the car. If they take a different path, if they have a little worry, if he shakes more hands that day, I constantly think about you're off by a couple seconds and the whole world changes from where he moves in that car. And but I think at the end of the day, I think that thing with World War II, I don't see him as cocky just because he's got money or because he's from the Kennedy family. Because here's why: when he saves the day in World War II, his father basically is like, okay, you're done, time to come home. You're a hero. We can declare victory and let's get you home.
Right.
And JFK instead says, no, Dad. Rather than what, the current presidents do, what he says is, no, Dad, I'm staying. I still have more lives to stay in World War II. He stays in the fight. So he's ready to go from day one. He has that cockiness of, you know what? It's like that moment in Garp, when the plane lands into the house, and then you see Robin Williams says, well, take the house. Why? What's the odds of this ever happening again?
Right.
And JFK, that's the moment, right? Like, they tried to kill him in World War II. They didn't. Richard Pavlik in the story we tell in the book, tries to kill him, tries to come with 7 sticks of dynamite and blow him up, and doesn't. Tries to find him at church, you'll see in the book, takes a second shot at him and still misses. And you're like, if you're JFK, why should you be worried? What's the odds of it ever happening again?
So whatever happened to Pavlik? What was the end of Pavlik's story? Because we know the end of Oswald's story, but we don't know the end of Pavlik's story. Yeah,
Pavlik, it's fascinating. Pavlik winds up getting caught up in really for the first time. They're really trying to think. The irony is Pavlik gets caught up in the court system, and they're trying to figure out if he's like guilty and conscious of what he's doing, or if by reason of insanity you should let him off. And he's in prison and in jail for so long, for 3 years, that by the time he's released ironically on legislation that JFK himself passes, that if you're crazy, we shouldn't keep you incarcerated. And so Pavlik finally, 3 years later, in the irony of all ironies, gets released because of the guy who he tried to kill. And he's a miserable guy who's obviously pretty much whacked in the brain. He's and truthfully, when he finally comes out 3 years later, he goes back to the guy who caught him. He goes after him and threatens him, but then he just dies soon after. He's in no physical shape for it because he's just an old man at that point. But it's a time. What it kicks off, and what you see from this moment, this lost moment, is Pavlik goes to buy like 10 sticks of dynamite, using 7 of them, and now because of what happened in Oklahoma City, we don't let you go buy dynamite. We report it. We make a note. We make a thing. We write it down. If you're hoarding your dynamite, we tend to pay attention. But back then, they don't. But it's thanks to things like what happened in Richard Pavlik's case that we make and put those systems in place. Because, at the time, he starts buying dynamite, and the guy in the dynamite store is like, in the fertilizer store is like, why are you buying all this dynamite? And he's like, well, I got a lot of tree stumps, because that's how they used to get rid of big tree stumps, blow them up. And he's like, well, guy, postal worker needs a lot of dynamite. Guess he needs a lot of tree stumps removed. But Pavlik's story, again, for me, what is fascinating is the guy who winds up saving the day. And again, I don't want to ruin. Jackie has a key hand in saving JFK's life in this moment, but so does this other postal worker. And that guy doesn't want any part to do with the story. There's he grants one interview and he's like, I'm not a hero, I'm not anyone. And for me, Rick, we've talked a lot about this, but I believe that's the story of America. We all remember the bold names. We remember how beautiful Jackie is. Remember how beautiful JFK is. But it's this guy who no one knows and no one can tell you his name and nobody knows about him, but who basically is like, you know what? This guy Pavlik seems like a little bit of a kook, and maybe I should say something about him. And that guy's just lost to history. Right. But that's where our history is written, as the names you don't know. And I love that this book, when you're done with the JFK Conspiracy, you'll see a whole side of JFK that we've thrown aside, but it is just as vital today as we look at where America is currently right now.
I think it would have been a much different world if the Palm Beach Police, the Secret Service, hadn't picked him up. I think he sounds like one of those guys who had gotten into his head and become obsessed that this was what he was going to do. This is what he was going to pull off. And that distinction between the screamers, the ranters, the howlers and the hunters, dynamite doesn't take as much discipline and planning as some of these other, look, Oswald was clearly more of a plotter and a schemer and figured it out. But this is one of those, so many things in history have to go right for this not to go wrong. And I think it's a fascinating look into this. And as always, folks, it's incredibly readable because Brad and Josh Mensch, his co-author on this, they have a way of taking history and making it vibrant and alive, and in this case, kind of riveting. And you see this potential tragedy play out with the knowledge that a greater one will play out in just a couple of years after that. And as I always like to tell people, that's my weird Kennedy story. My mother was a young Democrat when Kennedy came to Tampa just a couple days before his assassination. And they did a big Young Democrats event at Al Lang Field in Tampa Stadium, or what was then the big stadium in Tampa. And he left the next morning. I was born on the morning of the 21st, and exactly 24 hours to the minute, the next day he was killed.
And you just said the magic words, right? Like, what happens if Pavlik does what he's trying to do?
Right.
And you can argue about do we make it to the moon, or does LBJ assert the civil rights movement earlier, or do we avoid the Bay of Pigs, or and all of the disasters that happen? And those are all feasible, reasonable sliding door moments in the Kennedy administration. Mm-hmm. But I think, and who knows what happens in those moments, but what I think is most interesting when you ask that question, because you have to ask that question when you look at this story, is that I do think that JFK, and I'd be curious what you think about this. I think obviously he's the first television president, but I think he's also because of that, he's that first president in modern time who's that person you idolize and want to be like, in that way that is like, not that he birthed the American dream, I don't want to overstate it, but the American dream in that modern way of like the beautiful family and the beautiful spouse and your beautiful life.
Oh, sure.
In a way that we've chased and never, I feel like to this moment, we're still chasing it. And you've had hints of it with Obama, hints of it for some people with Reagan, of course, and some people with Trump. But Kennedy was the birth of that thing, that not just that you can be the president, which has always been there since Lincoln and before, right, but that idea that this world, this amazing world, can be yours and it's attainable. It's right there. Just live like this guy and it's going to be yours. And we've been selling that since, not well and never to the extent that JFK does. But to me, that's what, if JFK dies early, there's a part of me that wonders who's the person that launches that in a way that LBJ never could have. No one else can do that. LBJ can pass certain policies that are the same and do other things that are similar or different, but no one can live that beautiful life the way that Kennedy's did.
I mean, he was the first suburban president in the way that the suburbia of the late 1950s and early 1960s defined the baby boomer generation, Gen X, and even millennials in ways that he felt at home to those people. He felt right to those folks. The thing about this book, Brad, that I find really interesting is it does open up all these other alternative pathways when you think about it. I mean, so many differences. If he had taken the threat of this guy seriously, does Dallas change? Yeah, like we talked about, maybe it does.
But I think the other thing that happens is, and you just hit on it, is what's happening in America is there's a new word that breaks through around the time of JFK, right at the end of the 50s and beginning of the 60s, and it's the word teenager. It may exist, but we forget that back then, it wasn't just because of what your politics were. You used to come home, and when you were growing up and you were done with school, you took your dad's job. That's what the thing was, is because that's what you did. And then that generation, that next generation started getting more educated than any generation before it. When they moved to the suburbs, education came. And when education comes, you have people who are like, I don't want to have my dad's job. I want to have my own job. And so now JFK becomes, like you were saying, the embodiment of this suburban experience, this embodiment of, he's not my dad's presidential candidate, he's my presidential candidate. Sure. And that is obviously, and I think, it's a fact, again, we kind of throw that all to the side and we just, again, look at the end result. But that ability for them to work in that way and become everything that Eisenhower, truly Eisenhower is walking around an embodiment of the 50s and JFK is an embodiment of the 60s. In fact, when he gets elected, Eisenhower used to come off the plane and they say, the schedule says, come from the plane, go straight to the car. That's what Eisenhower would do. When JFK gets elected in December, he comes off the plane and he sees that on the runway, on the fence that leads to the runway, there's all these people cheering at him and waving. And JFK beelines. He doesn't, I'm not going to the car. He's going to shake hands and kiss babies. And the Secret Service, I know it seems so obvious now, but they didn't do that back then like that. Obviously there were train tours and things like that, but JFK brought it to that next level. People are screaming like the Beatles are there. Sure. And even before the Beatles. But in that moment, the Secret Service don't know what to do. It's the first moment after Eisenhower, they're like, oh, what do we do now? And they realize they have to pivot. And you think about 1963, what happens when they first get to Florida, they're sitting there and watching the house, and JFK's looking at them by the pool, and they're all sweating because they're in their heavy suits. It's winter.
Right.
And he goes up to them and says, hey, what size are you guys? What shirt size are you? And he goes inside and he brings out short sleeve Hawaiian shirts for everyone. The guy's been elected like a couple hours. They're guarding him for less than a day and they're wearing his clothes. This is not your dad's president. And you gotta kind of understand that. We don't, it's just, we don't love JFK just because he's handsome. The guy is just a different mold than anything anyone saw. It just unleashed like rock and roll. It was like that in politics.
It was a cultural presidency like few we've ever seen. We've had 4 of them in the last 60 years: JFK, Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump.
That's what I think. I agree.
Well, folks, I really recommend this book, The JFK Conspiracy, The Secret Plot to Kill Kennedy and Why It Failed, by Brad Meltzer and Josh Mensch. Get it, read it, because it's not the killing you think. It will really give you a lot of thought about how contingent history is at every single moment. Thanks for coming on the show today. Appreciate you, my friend, as always. Look forward to talking to you again very soon.
Thank you, my friend.